Somewhere in your family, generations back, someone went hungry, not metaphorically hungry, actually physically starving, for months, maybe longer. You never met them, you don't know their name, you've probably never once thought about them while staring at your bank balance. But there's a real possibility. Their hunger changed the way your body handles money today, not through a story passed down, not through some vague sense of family history. Through an actual physical mark, sitting inside your cells right now. And the evidence for this isn't speculation. It's sitting in one of the most carefully documented events in medical history. Let's go back to the winter of 1944. During the final months of the Second World War, Nazi forces blockaded food supplies into the Western Netherlands in retaliation for a railway strike. What followed is now known as the Dutch Hunger Winter. For about 5 months, adults in cities like Amsterdam and The Hague were surviving on roughly 400 to 800 calories a day, less than a third of what an adult body actually needs to function. People ate tulip bulbs. They boiled sugar beets meant for livestock. Roughly 20,000 people died before Allied forces liberated the region and food finally arrived again. Here's what made this particular famine so scientifically valuable decades later. It had a precise start date, a precise end date. And because the Dutch medical system was, and still is, exceptionally well organized, doctors had kept detailed birth records, weight records, and health records for the entire affected population, both before, during, and after the famine. This gave scientists something almost unheard of in human research, a naturally occurring experiment with a clearly defined beginning, a clearly defined end, and decades of follow-up data on real people who lived through it. That precision is what made a discovery possible, decades later, one that would reshape how we think about inheritance itself. In 2008, a researcher named Bastiaan Heijmans at Leiden University Medical Center led a team studying people who had been conceived during those exact famine months, the children of mothers who were pregnant, right at the height of the starvation. Decades later, now adults in their 50s and 60s, these individuals showed something specific in their DNA, not a mutation, not damaged genes. A chemical marker called a methyl group, attached to a gene known as IGF-2, insulin-like growth factor 2, which helps regulate growth and metabolism throughout a person's entire life. Compared to their own same-sex siblings, born before or after the famine to the same parents, the famine-exposed individuals had measurably less methylation on that gene. A chemical mark that was still there, 6 decades after the famine had ended. This is called an epigenetic change. Your DNA sequence, the actual genetic code, the letters themselves, stays exactly the same. But your body can attach small chemical tags to that code, switches, essentially, that turn certain genes up or down in their activity without altering a single letter underneath. Think of your DNA as sheet music. The notes on the page never change. But epigenetic marks are like tiny handwritten annotations in the margins, telling the orchestra to play certain sections louder or softer, or to skip them entirely. And what Heijmans showed was that a single, severe biological event, months of starvation during early pregnancy, could leave one of these annotations in place for an entire lifetime. But the story gets stranger, because the effect didn't stop with the people who were actually starved. A separate line of research, led by a Swedish scientist named Lars Olov Bygren, working later with British geneticist Marcus Pembrey, looked at historical harvest and famine records from a remote, isolated region called Överkalix in northern Sweden, with data going back to the 1800s. Because Överkalix was so cut off, its parish kept unusually detailed agricultural and population records, harvest yields, birth registries, cause of death, going back generations. Bygren and Pembrey tracked what happened to the grandchildren of people who had experienced either a famine, or conversely, a period of unusually abundant food, during one very specific window of their own childhood, the slow growth period, right before the onset of puberty. The numbers were striking. Grandsons of men who had experienced a famine during that narrow childhood window had a significantly lower risk of death from cardiovascular disease and diabetes decades later in their own lives. Grandsons of men who had feasted during unusually abundant harvests during that same window showed the opposite pattern, a substantially higher risk of early death from these same conditions. The effect appeared to skip a generation entirely. And strangely, it appeared to travel specifically down the male line, tracking with the food supply experienced by paternal grandfathers, not grandmothers. Bygren and Pembrey's findings suggested something that felt almost impossible to accept at first glance, that the nutritional experience of a grandparent, decades before you were even conceived, could be encoded into sperm cells, biologically, and passed down 2 generations, to affect the health of a grandchild who would never meet them. Around the same time, a very different but closely related body of work was building toward the same conclusion from an entirely different angle. A British physician named David Barker, working at the University of Southampton in the late 1980s, had been studying something that seemed unrelated at first: regional maps of heart disease deaths across England and Wales. Barker noticed the areas with the highest rates of adult heart disease weren't the areas you'd expect: wealthy, industrial, or urban. They were poor, rural regions that had experienced the worst infant mortality rates decades earlier, in the early 1900s. Barker's controversial proposal, now known as the Barker hypothesis, or the fetal origins of adult disease, was that poor nutrition in the womb doesn't just risk immediate harm to a baby. It programs the developing body to expect a lifetime of scarcity, adjusting metabolism, blood pressure regulation, and fat storage permanently, based on conditions experienced before birth. A fetus undernourished in the womb effectively makes a biological bet that it's being born into a world of scarcity and adjusts its entire physiology to survive that world efficiently. The problem arrives later, when that same body, primed for scarcity, is instead born into relative abundance, and that mismatch between the prediction and the reality becomes a source of chronic disease. 3 separate lines of research: a Dutch famine, a Swedish harvest record, and English infant mortality maps, all pointing toward the same underlying mechanism. Your body is capable of encoding a prediction about scarcity based on events that happened before you were born, sometimes generations before you were born, and carrying that prediction forward as your biological default setting. Now here's where this connects directly to money. Metabolism and financial behavior are far more tightly linked than most people assume. The same IGF-2 pathway that Heijmans found altered in famine survivors is deeply involved in how your body regulates blood sugar, fat storage, and your baseline stress response to any signal of resource scarcity. Researchers studying famine survivors and their descendants have documented elevated rates of what's sometimes called a thrifty phenotype. A body that responds to any modern signal of scarcity, even something as abstract as a shrinking bank balance on a phone screen, by aggressively conserving, hoarding, or treating the situation as existential, regardless of whether it actually is. In practical terms, this means a nervous system shaped by inherited famine signaling doesn't necessarily distinguish between an ancestor's genuine starvation and your own late-month low balance. It responds to both with the same ancient conservation programming. Sometimes that shows up as anxious hoarding, refusing to spend even on things you can genuinely afford. Sometimes, paradoxically, it shows up as impulsive spending, because a body convinced that scarcity is always just around the corner can swing toward get what you can, while you can just as easily as toward save everything, trust nothing. Both responses can trace back to the exact same underlying prediction, that resources are fundamentally unreliable and the body had better prepare accordingly. This also helps explain something researchers have long noticed but struggled to fully account for: why financial anxiety often feels wildly disproportionate to a person's actual objective circumstances. Someone with a stable job, savings, and no real risk of hunger can still feel a genuine physical stab of panic checking their account balance, a level of alarm that doesn't match the actual numbers in front of them. If some of that reactivity was set generations ago, calibrated to a genuine famine or genuine scarcity that a grandparent or great-grandparent survived, the mismatch starts to make a strange kind of sense. The body isn't overreacting to your current situation. It may be reacting accurately to a situation that happened to someone else a long time ago, using the only copy of the instructions it was given. This isn't destiny, and it isn't an excuse. Epigenetic marks, unlike your underlying DNA sequence, are not fixed forever. Studies on the Dutch hunger winter cohort in similar populations have shown that some of these methylation patterns can shift over the course of a lifetime, influenced by diet, chronic stress levels, and long-term environment. You are not permanently sentenced by what happened to a grandparent you never met. But you may be starting from a different biological baseline than someone whose ancestors never faced that kind of scarcity, a baseline that shows up as a slightly faster jump to panic around money, or a stress response to financial uncertainty that feels disproportionate to the actual numbers sitting in front of you. Think about what this would have meant for most of human history, long before famine researchers ever put a name to it. For nearly all of the time our species has existed, food supply was never guaranteed. A hard winter, a failed harvest, a drought that lasted one season too long could mean the difference between a community that thrived and one that starved. Bodies that could remember scarcity, that could pass forward a kind of biological caution to the next generation, and the generation after that weren't malfunctioning. They were doing exactly what evolution built them to do, preparing descendants for a world that might, statistically, look a lot like the hardest years their ancestors had already survived. The problem isn't that this system exists. The problem is that it was never updated for a world with grocery stores, direct deposits, and mobile banking apps, a world where the ancient warning signs of scarcity and the modern ones can look almost identical to a body that's simply following very old instructions. There's something almost humbling in all of this. The tightness in your chest when you check your bank balance might not be entirely yours. It might be an echo, chemically preserved, of a winter you never lived through, carried forward in a molecule attached to a gene you didn't choose, inherited from someone whose name you may not even know, who survived something you can barely imagine, using nothing but whatever their body had left. Somewhere in your family, generations back, someone went hungry and somehow made it through. And in a very real, measurable, scientifically documented way, a part of how your body still responds to not having enough, right now today, might be the last and quietest thing they ever gave you.